The last speaker before the lunch break is Jules Evans, who incidentally was the organizer for STOICON for the last 2 or 3 years, maybe, 2 years in London. And the guy who just basically convinced us and volunteered us to do it this year here, and we're very glad of that. His title is Stoicism as a Wellbeing Intervention in the Workplace, Prisons, and Mental Health Charities.
Okay, so last talk before lunch. How are you all feeling? I want you all to stand on. I want you all to stand on your feet, and I want you to stretch. Put your hands right up in the air, and now I want you to shake your arms. Have a little jump up and down. That's it. Now I want you to turn to the person next to you and give them a high five. All right. Now I want you to turn to another person near you, and I want you to look deep into their eyes, and then I want you to kiss them. Come on. Okay, that's enough in the back row. Cut that out. Okay, take a seat, everybody. All right, here's what I'm going to talk about. I think I can get through it in 15 minutes, maybe. I'm going to talk about 3 things. First of all, how modern Stoicism has grown and how people are now using it, including me, in places like coaching. Secondly, what's missing from Stoicism? Is anything missing from Stoicism, or is it perfect? And finally, where next? Where is this movement going to go next? Where are people like you going to take it next? Okay, so I'm going to start off at the beginning of the 20th century. People have always been interested in Stoicism. It's too loud! It's okay at the back, okay. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, academic philosophers they pretty much ignored Stoicism. They thought it was too useful. It was too practical. So it wasn't really, worthy of their consideration. But Stoicism was kept alive in the beginning of the 20th century by self-help authors, by people like Dale Carnegie. He said that the quote by Marcus Aurelius, "Life itself is but what you deem it," were 7 words that could change your life. So while the snooty academics were completely ignoring Stoicism, it was kept alive by these kind of hustler types like Dale Carnegie in self-help. And then in the 1950s, Albert Ellis, who'd been trained in psychoanalysis, decided that it wasn't working. None of his patients were getting any better. And he looked around for other ways to heal emotions, other ways people could heal themselves. And he turned to Stoicism. And that led to the cognitive revolution and the creation of rational emotive behavior therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's really how I got into Stoicism. I was helped very much by CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I'll tell you quickly about it. I mean, I was a teenager in the 1990s, and my friends and I were, I guess you could say, like amateur neuroscientists. So we like to experiment on our brains with different drugs every weekend and see what the results were. Started off experimenting with marijuana, interesting results. Then with LSD, MDMA, magic mushrooms, fascinating results. But then I saw some of my friends have problems from this. My best friend had a psychotic breakdown on LSD, was locked up and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. 30 years later, still struggling with that very much. Other friends got bipolar disorder and so on. But it didn't really affect me until my first year at university. So I had a bad trip on LSD. It was very frightening. I didn't really talk to anyone about it. And then in university, the trauma started to come out. I started to get panic attacks, mood swings, depersonalization, nightmares, and I had no idea what was going on with me. What was going on with my emotions? I felt like a stranger to myself. I didn't know who I would be from one moment to the next, from one day to the next. So I was really terrified. I felt completely out of control. I left university and I got a job writing about German mortgage bonds. This is what happens if you mess around with drugs. The most boring job. And I was so socially anxious in this office. And I took a week's holiday, and I went to the British Library, and I read the only psychologist I'd heard of, Sigmund Freud. And I spent this whole week's holiday reading as many books by Sigmund Freud as I could to try and heal myself. It was pretty much the worst holiday ever. I can really recommend, if you're looking for holiday tips, don't do that. I was miserable at the start of the week. I was suicidal by the end of it. But then I discovered on the internet that I'd been diagnosed by an expensive therapist as suffering from social anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. He was paid per diagnosis. So I got this bumper diagnosis. And I found that they could apparently be healed by cognitive behavioral therapy. So I went along to a CBT support group for people who suffered from social anxiety. There wasn't actually a therapist there. One person in the group had illegally downloaded a course, a CBT course for social anxiety from the internet. And so we practiced this course every Thursday evening for about 3 months, encouraged each other on, and I got better. I mean, I didn't get completely better, but I stopped having panic attacks. My mood I started to understand my emotions and how I could control them. And I was fascinated by this therapy that had helped me so much. And I thought, where did it come from? Who invented it? I found out it had been invented by these two American psychologists, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. This was 2007. I was a freelance journalist. So I emailed Debbie, in fact, and I said, could I come and interview Albert Ellis? And she said, yes, but you better do it quickly, because this was 2007, and he was 92. So the next day, I was booked to fly back to Russia, where I was working as a journalist. Instead, I got a plane to New York. And I went to a hospital here in New York and interviewed Albert on his deathbed, pretty much. But I got to thank him for all of us, for inventing this therapy, which had helped not just me, but so many people. And a few years later, in fact, just a year later, my government in the UK started to put hundreds of millions of pounds into cognitive behavioral therapy, into making it free for people in Britain. It's now put £1 billion into CBT. It's kind of like a Stoicism for the masses. A year later, the US Army started to put $200 million into a program to train every soldier in the army in basic kind of Stoic techniques to try and teach them resilience. So I thought, this is fascinating. There's this incredible evidence-based therapy which governments are now putting billions of pounds and dollars into, and it comes from this 2,000-year-old philosophy, from these ancient Greeks. How is this not better known? How do people not realize that this ancient Greek philosophy is so cutting edge and still works so well? And I found there was only one person who seemed to be looking at the relationship between ancient Greek philosophy and CBT, and that was this Scottish guy called Donald Robertson. So I went and interviewed Donald 7 years ago. You can see our interview on YouTube, in fact. So there was this movement of kind of politics of well-being, these ideas from ancient philosophy, and particularly from Stoicism, that governments were spreading to the people. And I thought, on the one hand, that's amazing. Stoicism is having this huge revival, and governments are bringing it to the people. The other hand, I thought, but is there a risk of enforced Stoicism, where you must be a Stoic? If you're an American soldier, you have to take this course. Is that illiberal? So meantime, Stoicism was growing as a grassroots movement, thanks to the internet. In all the history of Stoicism, there'd never been much of a community of Stoics. Stoics aren't always that big on community. It's quite an individualist philosophy. But the internet enabled people to meet each other and connect through their interest in Stoicism. So there was a Stoic Yahoo group that I joined for a bit, but I left quite soon. I don't know if it's still going, because all anyone did was argue about what Greek terms meant. They were very pedantic. But then I came across this other group called New Stoa. Anyone heard of that, New Stoa? It was started in the late 90s by a guy in San Diego called Eric Weigart. And it's really a kind of online community for Stoics. And for a year or so, I did their newsletter. And I tracked down anyone who'd been helped by Stoicism, anyone who mentioned Stoicism in the news, and I interviewed them about how they used it. I came across these amazing stories. A Stoic policeman, a Stoic former gangster, a Stoic astronaut, Stoic politicians, if you can believe in such a thing, there are some. people who'd used Stoicism to overcome incredible problems in their life, far worse than mine. Chronic illness, anger, addiction, depression. And I told some of these stories and wrote about them in my book. These weren't academic philosophers. These were ordinary people who picked up Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and they'd used it in their life, and it had been a lifesaver for them. I just wonder, hands up here, has anyone here been really helped by Stoic philosophy in their life? Look at that. Look at all those stories of people. And you know, some of you, if any of you where it's really made a difference in your life, when you've been really down in life? Yeah. Look how many people are just here. That's amazing. So this group, New Stoa, we had our first gathering. We decided to meet face to face. And we met in 2010 in San Diego for 3 days of sun, sand, surf, and Stoicism. And it was the biggest ever gathering of Stoics. There were 8 of us. And we held it on Marcus Aurelius' birthday. We even baked a cake. Unfortunately, in that early attempt in the Stoic community, there was a schism. We fell out, all 8 of us, because some thought Stoicism should be a religion, and some hated the very word religion. But back then, in 2010, it was still a bit weird to say you were a Stoic. It was a bit like you went away at the weekends, to dress up like a Civil War historical, It was a bit freaky. But in the last few years, actually, we've seen Stoicism become more mainstream, thanks partly to some very popular books, which have said, hey, you can use this stuff. It still works. So Alain de Botton wrote a great book in 2000 called Constellations of Philosophy. Bill Irvine's book has been hugely popular, helped huge amounts of people. Donald's book, Tim's book, Ryan Holiday's book took Stoicism into places it doesn't ordinarily reach. So it became more mainstream. We also saw celebrities get into it. It's always good when celebrities get into your philosophy. So, for example, Tom Wolfe, the author, is a huge fan of Stoicism. Arianna Huffington writes about it in her book, Wisdom. Elle Macpherson, the supermodel, named her son Aurelius. There you go. Now, academics were still pretty scornful, a lot of them. I remember doing a talk at Durham University about my book, and this academic came in and picked it up, looked at it, read the back, and tossed it back down and said, well, it's just self-help. I'm sure I'll still think about that insult 50 years later. But some academics began to have interest in it. So in the 80s, you had people like A.A. Long. In France, Pierre Hadot. You had Julia Annis, of course, bringing it to light. In the 90s, Martha Nussbaum, one of the leading philosophers of the day, said not just about Stoicism, but a lot of these ideas from Greek philosophy, hey, we can still use them today. Lawrence Becker as well, of course, who's saying this isn't just history. We can still use this stuff today. In 2012, some of us met through Chris Gill at Exeter University for a project called Stoicism Today. Chris brought us together. Therapists, classicists, philosophers, to explore particularly the links between CBT and Stoicism. And we decided, on a whim, really, to run something called Live Like a Stoic for a week, where you could practice different Stoic exercises. And we'd make a free online course. And it massively took off. Thousands of people, as Donald said, have done this course, including, by the way, the coach of the New England Patriots. Took this course and taught it to his squad. And I believe they won the Super Bowl, right, in what you call football last year. So, I mean, Donald, who designed this course, could have charged thousands for this, but it was just given away for free, and it still is. So, academia has really helped the movement to grow in terms of funding, infrastructure, and credibility, and bringing it mainstream. So I then started to think, how about trying to take some of this Stoic wisdom into new contexts? So I designed a kind of 8-week course. Actually, it wasn't just in Stoicism, it was in different philosophies, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and so on, and how we could use it today. And I tried it out in 3 different places in 2013. A maximum security prison in Glasgow, a mental health charity, and a rugby club called Saracens, who are the European champions of rugby. And people really liked it. The prisoners I mean, an interesting experience for me. And, there was 10 of them in there for things like life imprisonment, most of them. But they really responded to Stoicism because they were in a situation where they controlled very little about their life. And they were like, what remains to me when I'm in prison? Where can I be free? What am I in control of? And you know what? The elite sports people, these rugby players, they also responded to the same thing. Because believe it or not, professional sports people, a lot of their life is beyond their control. Whether they get injured, whether they get picked, how the media treats them. Stoicism massively helped them to cope with that too. And I and other people have started to teach kind of courses in ancient philosophy in companies as well. A lot of CEOs love Stoic philosophy because, again, it helps them to accept what's beyond their control. Entrepreneurs as well, they're facing so much fear of failure, fear of what might go wrong. So a lot of entrepreneurs now use Stoicism as a kind of life hack, as they call it. And I think, universities as well. I've started to do some talks in like schools and universities for undergraduates. There's a massive problem with undergraduate stress. And not just undergrads, but PhDs and senior people in universities. And yet, we're not teaching this basic wisdom to them. There are some mindfulness centers in universities, but there's no centers for Greek philosophy. Why isn't it better known? Why aren't we teaching this stuff? In fact, Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, who wrote The Atlantic Story, all about the problem with undergraduate safe spaces and trigger warnings, he used to teach a course, in fact, at Virginia on flourishing, on the Stoics and so on. Here's a question, though. If you're taking Greek wisdom into places like schools, companies, organizations, should one just teach Stoicism and say, this is the philosophy? Now it's just up to you to follow it. Is that right? Or should we have more of an eclectic approach? People take different answers to that. I personally thought more of an eclectic approach. So I didn't just teach Stoicism. I taught various different philosophies. Okay, so what's missing from Stoicism? Or is it a perfect philosophy? Hands up if you think Stoicism pretty much gets it right. Hands up who here would call themselves a Stoic. Great. Okay, cool. So I'm going to suggest, I was also a Stoic. I've got a Stoic tattoo, slightly hasty in that. When I was a full-on Stoic. Anyone else? I think a few of us. Massimo's got a Stoic tattoo. There is a Stoic tattoo removal service. But actually, no, because Stoicism massively helped me too. I owe it a lot. However, I've decided that maybe there are some things missing from it. All right, Martha Nussbaum says that there are two main models of the emotions and how they work and how we can change them. One is the cognitive model of the emotions that comes from the Stoics. Albert Ellis called it the ABC model. A is an event that happens to you. B is how you interpret it through your thoughts. And C is the consequent emotion that you feel. And so you change your emotions by changing your thoughts, right? Changing B. But there's an alternative model of the emotions, which was developed by William James. And it basically says that our emotions are much more embodied than that. It's more like ACB. A is the event. You see a bear. C is how your body reacts. Your heart starts pounding. You start feeling really, agitated. Your breathing goes faster. And then that leads to B. You start thinking, I'm afraid. I better get out of here. So actually, there's a suggestion that our emotions come more through our bodies than through our thoughts and beliefs and opinions. And this has influenced neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio and Joseph Ledoux. They put forward this Jamesian model of the emotions. Now, in that second model of the emotion, according to William James, you can change your emotions not just by changing your beliefs and thoughts, like the Stoics teach us, though that works, but also by changing your body. You're having a bad day, you go for a run. You feel quite down and depressed, you go and have a really good dance. In the words of LCD Sound System, you dance yourself clean, right? So Aristotle talked about this at the end of Politics. He said sometimes, Bacchic dancing, Bacchic ecstasy has its place. When you really dance, you can work off negative emotions, work off the discontents of civilization. So that's one of the, you think about breathing exercises. What you're doing there is you're changing your emotions and your thoughts by changing your body. So, and another thing that William James said is we don't just heal ourselves through rationality. In most Greek philosophy, the godlike part of you is your reason, your rationality. And if you want to heal yourself, you use your reason and rationality. But James says rationality is only one type of consciousness. And there are other types of consciousness which can also be really useful and healing. And he talks in the varieties of religious experience about kind of ecstasy, altered states of consciousness, which you could arrive at through meditation, through ritual, through music, through the arts, and through psychedelics. And the ancient Greeks used both. They used philosophy and rationality. But every year they also went to the ritual of Eleusis, where they drink a potion made out of corn, which sent them on this kind of 3-day trip down into the underworld and they're born again. Historians think that this corn potion was some kind of type of lysergic acid. And Cicero said the greatest gift that the ancient Greeks ever gave was not philosophy, it was Eleusis. It was these rituals, it was psychedelics. So there you go, Stoic psychedelics. So basically, this is an alternate way to heal yourself. Stoicism in Greek philosophy says you can heal yourself through self-control, rationality, and self-knowledge. But there's this alternate model of healing, which says you can heal yourself through surrender, through letting go of control, through listening to your body, through altered states of consciousness. Which one's right? I think they're both right. They're both right. There are these two ways we can heal ourselves and change ourselves. And if you look at ancient Greek culture, they had room for both. They had room for both Socrates and rationality, and also Dionysus and ecstasy. All right, last couple of minutes. What's missing? No, not what's missing. Where are we going next? Lunch. So where's the movement going to go? Well, it's up to you, really. I don't really know. I'm not sure. It's up to you. I think it's going to get much bigger, and it's going to be brought into new places like companies. There's going to be more and more of it in self-help, because people have a hunger for proven wisdom, wisdom that's lasted, wisdom that works. I would suggest the way it's really going to spread is some people might say, let's make Stoicism a religion. This is the thing that works. Let's just take this out. But I think it's very important, if you're teaching a wisdom technique in a place like a school or a company, that you leave room for people to disagree. That you don't go in there and say, I know exactly the answer. I know the philosophy of the good life. I know what will make you happy. Because we're all different. We all have different philosophies of the good life. And if I went into that prison in Scotland and said, I know the answer, I wouldn't have, they'd have given me hell. What they liked about it in this group was they had room to disagree and say, I like this about Stoicism, but I prefer this about Epicurus. And also to come, to share their own wisdom. So that's why I think eclecticism is the way to go. Okay, lunch. Thank you.
Not quite yet. We have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has them. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was awesome. Seriously, you were a talented speaker. Thank you.
I don't know if you heard that. He said I'm a talented speaker.
The way I thought of Stoicism and has a huge impact on my life is it's really a skill set.
Right. It's a skill set, yeah.
Skill set. And I was wondering how you reconcile that with your approach to collecting.
I mean, how do I combine eclecticism with the fact that Stoicism is a skill set? It combines brilliantly because, which techniques work. If you look at Seneca, he took techniques from Epicurus. So the idea of focusing on the present moment, not worrying about the past or the future. Seneca took that from Epicureans. He said it's okay sometimes to raid the enemy camp. So there are particular techniques that I've found really useful. I mean, the one for me is just reminding myself what's in my control and what's not. I had bad social anxiety, very fixated on other people's approval. That was beyond my control. And I got better by thinking what's in my control, my own beliefs and opinions, and accepting when people don't like me.
You're doing fine.
Is that
One more very quick one.
So as someone who's dedicated to spreading the word of Stoicism and other philosophies, I found myself telling people I was coming to a Stoic convention, and it's the same thing, self-help, and immediately wrote it off.
right?
How do you get around that obstacle, and how do you present the ideas that we're talking about in here
Yeah.
to the average person without it sounding hokey and self-help?
How do you present Stoicism without making it sound hokey? I mean, on the whole, the problem I face is how do you present Stoicism without it sounding totally academic and over-intellectual? So that's where I think the risk is in the UK. But, I mean, if they say, oh, is that just self-help? You say, actually, some of the greatest minds of human culture were into Stoicism. Like, Stoicism massively influenced Shakespeare, massively influenced Montaigne. Some of the founding fathers were really into Stoicism. Some of the great minds of the ancient world, like Cicero and so on, really into it. So, like, if you think like learning how to take care of yourself and take care of your emotions is hokey, you're not taking responsibility for yourself. I think what's interesting, I mean, Stoicism is a kind of a form of emotional self-management which a lot of guys are okay with. Because I'm not sure, partly because it has this self-reliance thing a little bit. So, yeah, so I find it really, like people like rugby players are quite into it and stuff. It can get too far. They can start thinking, I am a Spartan, I am invincible. So there is a balance. There is such a thing as taking it too far. But, yeah.
Thanks very much. All right, guys.